Hey, what's up, y'all? So we're going to be installing the Sparco R333 into the VB, but this process is pretty similar across most vehicles. So you'll purchase your seat, and then you'll need the mounting hardware, the slider, the seat base. So currently for the VB, I believe Planted is the only company that's making the seat bases. There aren't any from Recaro or Sparco or anything yet. But I got the slider from Sparco, the seats from Sparco, the hardware is Sparco, and then you'll also need some resistors, or a resistor, but it came in a pack of 100, so I've got plenty if anyone in Austin needs an extra. And then that resistor will just go into your airbag plug so that you don't have an airbag light on inside your car. So next up, I'll go ahead and disconnect the battery and go ahead and pull out the old seat. So to mount the seat on the slider, the first thing I did was adjust the slider some so that you could access one of the holes where you mount it. Got it lined up more or less. And you're gonna use the short bolts. So you have the short bolts that connect your slider to your seat, and then this hardware, your longer bolts with the washers and the nuts, that's to attach the whole thing to your seat base. So I went ahead and got it lined up and put a couple screws in just to make sure it was correct, and then I popped the screws back out, and I'm just going to hit them with a little bit of thread lock and then put them back in. I don't want them to come loose on me when it's vibrating. So after that, I went ahead and set the seat on top of the base facing the right direction. If you're not sure the orientation, a quick way to find out is to just look at where your seatbelt buckle mounts, and that's going to be where your right hip is. I guess that's if you're in the States or someplace that has left-hand drive vehicles. So then you take your longer bolts and they go through here. And your washer and your nut come at it from underneath. Go ahead and tilt it. That's one. And I'm gonna come back and tighten them up with the hand tools. And so now that you have two bolts holding it to the seat base, you can adjust the seat and then put the other two back into the slider, and then the other two into the base, and you'll have all four in each. All right, so now I have all the short bolts and all the long bolts in place. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up the hardware. So it's an Allen wrench, I'm not sure what size this is, for the inside of the bolts. And then it's a 13 mil for the Sparco hardware. I'm not gonna go too tight yet. I just wanna make sure everything's lined up before I tighten it really good. Alright, now you gotta slide the seat back so you can access the bolts in the front again. I found that the easiest way to slide it back is to kind of sit on it and gently use the slider. In theory, the slider. All right, welcome back. So there's been a bit of a gap in between where I was working on the install video and now, but basically we had run into an issue and I just didn't record it all. But what was happening was where the slider mounted to the base of the Sparco seat was not allowing enough range of motion for the handle to release the locking mechanism. So you would think the Sparco slider against a Sparco seat would have the amount of clearance that it needs, but it didn't. So as a fix for that, we kind of we put a couple of washers in between the slider and the seat in the front two bolts, and then we used the longer of the bolts in that hardware kit in the front and then the shorter ones in the rear. So normally you would use the short bolts for the seat, but I wanted to make sure that there were enough threads all the way around. So luckily the short bolts still had enough meat to mount the slider to the seat base, and then the longer bolts had plenty of meat to do the washers that we had to add on the front. But it's now in the car, it's functioning properly, and yeah. So one thing that they don't really talk about when you're doing these is the seatbelt buckle. So where the buckle mounts to the planted seat bracket, you need a bolt for that. It's not included in the hardware kit for the seat, and on the factory seat it's welded. It's basically a stud and a nut, and the stud is welded onto the factory seat, so you can't reuse it for aftermarket seats. So we ended up using the bolt that I had laying around, and all the memes about a guy who holds onto a bag or a box of hardware for a decade and gets excited when he finally gets to use one. Well, I had just the right bolt that came from a seatbelt in an old BMW a long time ago, but it worked. So seatbelt buckle is mounted nice and secure. The seat is in, it's adjusted, nice and centered on the steering wheel now. Bolster feels pretty good, but I actually haven't driven it yet, so I'm gonna get it cleaned up. We have a cruise this weekend out to get some barbecue. I'm gonna get the car washed and then get some seat time in the new seat, see how it feels.